What's up, guys? Welcome back to the ELI5 podcast. My name's Kyle, and I run Hedgehog. We run a small validator as well, so this kind of ties into today's episode, actually. If you do have Sol staked, consider re-delegating to the Hedgehog Spiky Validator, or just stake with us if you're buying Sol on this dip. But either way, let's jump into it. SIMD-0228. What is it? Let's explain it at a high level. Try to keep it simple, and then we'll dive into some of the more nuanced discussion that's going on. And I guess our current take, to be honest, I've definitely gone back and forth this week listening to a lot of the discussions that have happened. But let's just kick it off with what is SIMD? What is a SIMD? A SIMD is a Solana improvement document. It's basically a proposal to improve Solana. This one, 0228, is specifically referring to a change in the inflation or emission that Solana emits. So when you stake your Sol, you obviously get that like yield or that staking reward. And part of that is a base emission or inflation rate. The other side of that is, I guess, like rev or economic activity. Basically, it's like priority fees, MEV, and things like that. So right now, the original inflation schedule was pulled from Cosmos. I think it started at 8%, but basically every year that rate decreases by 15% until it hits a like terminal rate of 1.5%. So right now we're sitting at around 4.5% roughly. The reason that you might hear 7% thrown around is because it's 4.5%. 4.5% of the total supply is what the emissions are. However, if only 60% of Sol is staked, or I think roughly like 64% of Sol is staked right now, that 64% is what's getting that 4.5% of the total supply. So to do simple math, if you take 4.5 of 100, so that's 4.5%, and then you divide 4.5 by how much is staked, which is 64%. That's who you're dispersing that 4.5% to. You get roughly 7%. So while it is a fixed yield, our current inflation is technically a variable rate based on the percentage of Sol staked. Keep that in mind for later. So anyways, this new proposal, SIMD-0228, basically what it is doing is it is saying, let's move to a variable rate that is based on, or a variable rate of the emissions or inflation based on the amount of Sol staked. So what does that mean? Well, basically what that means is if the amount of Sol staked were to stay constant and this were to go into full effect, the inflation rate would drop from the 4.5% right now to 0.87%. So let's see, how do we break this down? Okay, let me just keep going with that. So it would drop from 4.5 to 0.87 if the amount of Sol stayed at 64% of Sol staked. Now, if more Sol was staked, so it went from 64 to 70% to 80%, that inflation rate would just continue to trend towards zero, right? It would just go down further, right? Because you want to disincentivize having a super, super high percentage of staked Sol. Now, conversely, if it were to drop, I think at like 40% of Sol staked, it would be roughly the same percentage as it is right now. So you would have to see the amount of Sol staked drop from 64% down to 40%. So people would have to unstake and the inflation rate would go back up. And the reason is if it drops too low, like 30%, 20% of Sol staked, you want to increase that inflation or emission to incentivize people to stake in order to provide security for the network. The whole point of a proof of stake network is that people are staking their Sol, delegating it to validators in order to process transactions and secure the network. So that's kind of a high level. So what does this mean for users? Well, as a user, if we were to implement 0228, if this were to go into full effect, and when I say full effect, the reason is it's probably going to take about 6 months after, if let's say we vote on this starting on Epoch 753, which I think is tomorrow, Friday at some point, is when that starts. I think it's a 2 epoch voting period. Maybe. And then you need what is it called? A supermajority. You need like 67% of votes to basically vote yes in order for it to pass. So if this passes, it'll take about 6 months to code out, implement, test. And then from there, so what would that put us at? March, April, May, June, July, August, September, right? So September, tentatively, is when this could go live on mainnet. And then there's as part of this proposal, a 50 epoch rollout. So what does that mean? It means that instead of just going down to that 0.87% inflation because this new thing is implemented, the idea is that we would gradually drop from our current inflation rate of 4.5%, a fixed rate, over 50 epochs. We would gradually go to whatever the inflation rate is based on the percentage of SOL staked. So if it stays at 64%, it would take 50 epochs. An epoch is roughly 2 days right now. So basically 100 days, what is that, a little over 3 months to roll that out. So all in all, it's probably 9 months at a minimum before we see a full implementation of SIMD-0228, meaning we would actually hit the rate that this proposal is proposing. But what does that mean for a user? For a user, that means that your staking rewards would drop, assuming that the stake percentage stays the same, would drop by over 50%, probably even more than that. And the reason is you're taking that base inflation rate of 4.5% and lowering it to 0.87%, right? So that's a pretty significant drop. The other side of rewards is that economic activity, number of transactions, priority fees, all that stuff. That's maybe anywhere from like 0.5% to 3%. And that, again, depends on the actual on-chain activity. What are the other arguments for this? So one argument is that, and let's just bring up a tweet here. So Mert basically said the strongest argument, so this was in response to a tweet from Andrew, who had a nice long thing. Definitely go read this. But basically, Mert was countering this. The strongest argument for SIMD-0228 is likely improves number go up over time. And Mert's countering this, saying like, no, this is kind of irrelevant. It's not about that. The strongest argument is that it incentivizes and speeds up the timeline towards a network centered on rev, right? So fees plus MEV, not the issuance or inflation yield that you're getting for staking your SOL, which I think I definitely agree with, and I think most people agree with. And Craig from Reciprocal had a great post on this as well. He's basically saying that Reciprocal's stance is that the best thing for Solana is to extend the comment period by 60 days. The reason is this proposal came out like middle or beginning of January. It's been less than 2 months, and we're supposed to vote on this. That could have very big impacts. Like I was saying, you as a user, if you're staking your SOL, your rewards are going to drop by over 50%. This could also cause DeFi yields to drop by over 50% because a lot of these DeFi yields and just, strategies are based on the base, not necessarily just the base inflation, but just the staking APY that gets paid out. So that's the base inflation plus the economic activity, MEV, rewards, whatever you want to call them. So I think this sentence down here is what really resonates with us, and I think a lot of people, that most people are open to innovating on Solana's network economics, meaning most people are open and think that, yes, this inflation rate should go down. Technically, right now it is going down. It's going down by 15% per year. Maybe that could be faster. And I think that's kind of the big argument here. I think some of the arguments that are being made around this like tax leaky bucket thing are kind of hand wavy. And I also would say on the other side of it, a lot of the DeFi arguments are also, I don't want to say hand wavy, but kind of nothing burgers, because you could argue both sides. I could argue for a reason why DeFi rates and deposits in DeFi are all going to drop. And I could argue why they could go up, right? We can kind of see both sides here. And so I don't think that's what we should necessarily get caught up on and focus on. I do like Mert's stance, which is that the strongest argument is that it incentivizes and speeds up the timeline towards rev, right? Towards IBRL. The problem is that if we try to incentivize, and the entire point of Solana is IBRL, increase bandwidth, reduce latency, those 4 things, right? Just because we do that doesn't mean that we get more rev, right? Just because we have a blockchain that can handle 1 million TPS doesn't mean that you're going to do 1 million TPS. Look at Cardano, right? All those people are saying how great Cardano is, but it does like 0.5 TPS, right? Just because a blockchain can handle more doesn't mean there's demand for it. Now, obviously, we're actually seeing demand on Solana unlike Cardano, so good for us. We're sustaining over 1,000 TPS now, I think, and that's non-vote TPS. So that's great. But just because we IBRL and we incentivize IBRL doesn't mean that we will inherently see rev. And I think part of that is, I think one of the biggest concerns for me is that by decreasing inflation too early before we start seeing sustained rev or economic activity, is that you're kind of chopping off the legs of what, in my opinion, and this could obviously be argued both ways, is that some of these rates are being reflected within DeFi, right? Like that's helping to bootstrap DeFi. It's helping to bootstrap people wanting to, I don't want to say people are owning SOL to get a 7% yield on like a 100 vol asset, but there is, some I guess a reason to argue that, right? If the yield dropped to 1%, I don't think people are necessarily selling SOL to go to another asset yielding 10%, especially when you see the volatility, right? Because the upside volatility of just owning SOL is still very high and good. But I think that it does potentially crush DeFi. And I think the other side of it is that best case scenario is it doesn't kill off a bunch of small validators because they are somehow still profitable. But downside is that it does start to kill off validators because maybe they're still slightly profitable, but is it worth the time and attention and cost and other reasons to worry about it when you have a business to run? So for example, like a lot of teams, including Hedgehog, spun up a validator. We spun up our validator over a year ago, actually, before I feel like it really, really blew up. And a lot of people were like, wow, look at all this economic activity. We can make money from this. Let's spin up our own validator. Some people are outsourcing it, all of that stuff. But we actually internally run our own validator. And it has been great for us. It helped us extend our runway. We obviously get some revenue from it. And we think it just helps to further decentralize the network, right? We don't want a two validator network, right? That's not really decentralized. So if you start chopping off the legs of these smaller validators and make it less profitable because of, a minimum amount of sort of fixed costs to run a validator. Well, for us, like, yeah, maybe we're still making $500 a month on our validator after this SIMD goes into effect, which is like, okay, technically we're not losing money, but is that $500 worth just the extra mental capacity and time that's taken away from building the product? That kind of, I guess, like, is that enough positive EV for us? I don't know. And while I'm not saying this is something or a reason for other people to vote yes or no, that's just something that I'm thinking about as somebody that runs a validator and stakes, right? Like, I don't want to just say, well, you know what, it's not worth it for us to run a validator anymore. So instead of staking all my SOL with the Hedgehog spiky validator, I'm going to move it to Helios and just further centralize stake with Helios or with Coinbase or with some other validator, just because it's not worth it for us to manage because of the small amount of profit that we're getting from it. And so I think that downside is one of the bigger downsides. If you're looking at upside of lowering inflation, my simple solution, which I probably should have started with this, is why not just increase the rate at which we're dropping the inflation rate? So right now we're dropping the inflation rate from 15% a year, which will take us about 7 more years to hit that terminal rate of 1.5%. If we increase it to like 25% from 15%, that means we're dropping faster, and we would hit 1.5% or that terminal rate in only 4 years. So we're increasing the rate at which we decrease inflation. And the benefit there is we still have that like 4-year time horizon, which is a nice gradual drop. It gives us time to increase that economic activity that we all want to increase. And it doesn't cause as big of a drastic change, right? So instead of being 1 year, roughly less than 1 year with this SIMD-0228 proposal, it's still kind of a 4-year time frame. And I think the one thing is I do like the approach of like this, like, smart curve where the inflation rate changes based on the percentage of SOL staked. But what I will say is even if we have a fixed 1.5% terminal rate, it's technically still variable. And the reason for this goes back to what I said at the beginning. Right now, the inflation rate is 4.5%, but only 64% of SOL is staked, which means that 4.5% is of the total amount of SOL, but it's only distributed to the 64%. Therefore, the real rate is roughly 7%. And so even if the terminal rate is 1.5%, if the percentage of SOL staked dropped to like 30%, right? Well, the rate that you would actually be getting as a staker, as the 30% staking, is roughly 5%. So you are still increasing the staking rewards as the percentage goes down. And then obviously you're decreasing or getting closer to the 1.5% as you approach 100%. Now, 100% will never be staked. And the reason for that is you need it for rent on chain to pay transaction fees and all that stuff. So I don't think we'll ever get that high. But it technically varies even with the fixed rate. So something to keep in mind. And we can also still change it 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. It doesn't really matter. We could implement another SIMD to change it and make that 1.5% an actual variable rate, which then also varies based on the percentage staked. So I don't think that, I think right now our vote is going to be no. It's going to be no on SIMD-0228. I do like what Craig said from Reciprocal, that, maybe we just delay this by 60 days to look more into this. But I think like also what I'm proposing, which is like increase the rate at which we decrease inflation from 15 to 25% might be sort of a happy medium. And then that way we're still getting towards a lower rate faster. We're decreasing inflation at a faster rate. But then it still gives us time for maybe a better SIMD in the future. So these are kind of my thoughts. I'm thinking that Hedgehog will probably vote no. If you do stake with Hedgehog and want us to vote a certain way, please let us know, because we can split the vote. Basically, you claim tokens, and then you either send those tokens to a yes address or a no address in order to vote for yes or no. So say we get 100 tokens, we could send 50 to yes and 50 to no, right? And we can do that based on people staking with us. So please consider re-delegating or staking with some smaller validators like Hedgehog. It definitely helps us, and it allows us to vote on your behalf. I can be reached on Twitter, on Telegram, and Discord. So please reach out if you are staking and want to have us vote a certain way. I think we're leaning towards no. However, I have flip-flopped myself over the past couple of days just listening to the conversation. But I think if all holds constant as of right now and the vote happens tomorrow, no seems most likely. Hope this was helpful. I know it was pretty long. If you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up, share with others. Please let me know your comments. Hope I didn't misspeak too much, but that's kind of my take. A lot of these arguments kind of seem like nothing burgers, the tax, leaky bucket stuff, like that's always going to be present. Even if economic activity goes up and there's a 10% yield and there's zero inflation, those same people are going to be selling because of taxes, right? This doesn't solve that. Just because inflation goes away doesn't mean taxes go away. Same thing with DeFi. You could kind of argue rates going up, rates going down. But I think the one downside to this is that best case scenario is no validators drop off. Worst case scenario is validators do drop off because they're not profitable. And then I think most people would agree that we do want to decrease inflation. The question is, how quickly and what are the adverse impacts of doing something like this and it being rolled out within the next 9 months and having such a drastic change to the economics? I think we are still early and we need to see more economic activity, more rev happen on Solana. And my proposal of changing that inflation decrease rate from 15 to 25% would make that more gradual, still accomplishing the same goal. And we still have time to implement something like what SIMD-0228 is proposing, such as stake percentage-based inflation rate that changes. So lots of things to think about. Hope it was helpful. Again, if you enjoyed it, please give this a thumbs up, share it, and I look forward to anybody's feedback. Until next time, guys. Thanks for watching.